Hey, my name is Peter Bogert. Welcome to the world famous Roots studio here in Coopersburg. And this is episode number 29 of Roots. I'm glad that you've stopped by this week. I want to start with two questions. How many Bibles do you have in your home, not counting your phone? And the second question is, how many translations of the Bible do you have? You count them up, and I'll be back in just a moment. Now, over the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about some practical helps to reading the Bible well. And one of the things that I want to talk about as we get started is the subject of Bible translations. Now, for those of you who are younger, and I mean probably in your 30s and 40s and younger, let me take you on a little trip back to prehistoric times, if I can. In the late 1960s, the church had essentially two main translations to choose from, and overwhelmingly, Christians used the King James Version from 1611. In 1971, two new editions of the Bible were published. The first one is the New American Standard Bible. For those of you who come here to Calvary, Pastor Dave uses the NASB on Sundays, and it's a familiar English translation, what we would call a literal translation of the Bible, compared to the other edition that was published in 1971, which is the Living Bible, which was more of a paraphrase of the Bible with an attempt to make it as readable as possible, without necessarily grasping for word accuracy. Now, suddenly, after having the King James Bible and a couple of other more obscure translations to choose from, Christians began to have options to use more modern language Bibles. In the 70s, there were a number of people who moved away from the King James Version toward the New American Standard Bible. And then in 1973, just a couple years later, the New Testament of the New International Version was published. And the full Bible was released in 1978. And without any question, the New International Version is the most popular Bible next to the King James Bible, which still sells, I believe, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of copies every year. The NIV went through a revision some years later, and that revision was criticized for some things that were legitimate, but too deep to go into now. But the NIV still remains one of the top English Bibles that we have available to us today. Now, move forward to today, and new translations seem to be published nearly every year. And it seems like for each translation, there are many different editions, study Bibles, devotional Bibles, readers' Bibles, reference Bibles that use those particular translations. Let's talk for a moment about why we have so many translations. Is that a good thing or a bad thing or a really doesn't matter thing? I think that in many cases, we are blessed to have accurate new translations of the Bible. There are some that frankly are better than others. And I will next week talk about some of the ones that I recommend for your Bible reading. But in the mainline newer translations of the Bible can be very helpful. Why we have so many translations, I think the main answer to that is this. Since the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s, there has been an emphasis on having the Bible in the language of the common person. In fact, there were men like John Wycliffe and William Tyndale who lived back at or before the Reformation times, back in the 1300s and 1400s, and they were persecuted and even put to death because they dared to translate the Bible into the common language. Up until that point, the church had a stranglehold on the Bible. It was not available to the common person. The common person was forbidden to read it even if they could. And the Bible was available in Latin for priests and scholars to read, but that was it. The common, average, everyday person did not have the Bible in their own language. And John Wycliffe and William Tyndale were two men who gave us the first English translations. Wycliffe died, I believe, of natural causes, but in a couple centuries later, his bones were actually dug up and burned by the Roman Church as a symbol of the fact that he was condemned as a heretic for translating the Bible into the language of the people. Now, the wheres and whys of all that are too great for us to go into in this discussion. But we have people who, beginning back in those days, wanted to make sure that the average person who could read would read a Bible in their own native tongue. And by the way, I would suggest that you watch the video that I have linked to by John Piper on the life of William Tyndale. It's an hour long, but it is well worth your time. Tyndale was a fascinating person who gave so much of his life to giving us an English translation that we still rely on in some cases. There are still evidences of Tyndale's translation in the New Testament and Old Testament in our contemporary versions. Now, as language changes, new translations become helpful, if not plain necessary. So we can be grateful in most cases for the work that has gone into providing us with good translations of the Bible. Now, next week, what I want to talk about are some of the translations that I would recommend and why I would recommend them and why some translations differ from other translations. And I think it would be helpful to you as you think about how to best read your Bible for your own spiritual growth to make sure that you're reading from a translation that is most helpful in that process. And who knows, maybe you'll be introduced to one that is especially helpful to you or to someone else that you know and replace the one that you're using now. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Now, before we go, I have a giveaway. I have a brand new, hot off the presses, Christian Standard Bible, published by the Holman Publishing Company, Holman Bibles. This is a leather-bound, premium leather, black, red letter Bible. It's a 9-point type, so it's not the largest type. But the first person who texts me at 215-208-1181, you text me Bible and your name, and you get a free $60 Bible. Okay? It's a good translation, and I'll talk about it next week, okay? You have a great week. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.